Hello, I'm Dr. Natalie Mears. I'm a reader in Tudor and Early Stuart history at Durham University, and I'm going to give a series of lectures on Tudor politics and religion. I'm going to start with the question of how significant the gender of the monarch was during the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth. Now, the significance of the monarch's gender, at least when the monarch was female, has been of interest to historians for about 30 years now. Most of the attention has been paid to Elizabeth because more scholars work on her, the reign's longer, and there's more stuff on her. But there has been a little bit more on Mary recently. With Elizabeth, there's also a specific spin to the argument. Some historians, mainly feminist historians like Heisch, Crane, Cole and McLaren, argue that gender was the real problem for Elizabeth's reign, and it's what kind of defined her queenship, how it worked. Other historians like Patrick Collinson, John Guise, Stephen Alford and myself argue that religion was the real problem. Elizabeth wasn't kind of Protestant enough for some of her councillors, and that's where the conflict happened. So to answer a question about the significance of gender, we need to understand a few things. First of all, what did contemporaries think about gender and queenship and what problems arose from it? What did Mary, Elizabeth and their councillors think about gender and queenship? And then we need to think about how it actually worked in practice. And those are the areas that I'm going to cover now. So first of all, theories of queenship. 16th century England was a patriarchal society, so men ruled in terms of central government, local government and in the household. Women had few, if any, legal powers. They were seen as intellectually, physically and emotionally inferior to men. By the mid-16th century, however, we have an unusual kind of preponderance of women either as queens or having very important political positions. So in England, it's Mary and Elizabeth. In Scotland, we have Mary, Queen of Scots. We have her mother, who is regent. And then in France, we have Catherine de Medici, who is very prominent, particularly when her sons are kings of France. And so this kind of creates a problem because how can these women, who are inferior to men, actually rule over them? And it raises questions about how legitimate queenship was and how it should function. Now, in the English context, there are two really important pamphlets where these ideas were discussed. The first one was by the Scot John Knox and rejoices in the wonderful title of The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. I think you might be able to see where he's going with this one. It was mainly an attack on Mary I, and it was published a few months before her death. In this text, Knox argued that queenship was wholly illegitimate, that God's law, particularly as demonstrated in the Bible, said that women couldn't rule, and therefore it was against God's law that they should. It was also against nature. Another pamphlet was published a few months afterwards, and actually a few months after Elizabeth came to the throne. It was by a man called John Aylmer. He later becomes Bishop of London, and it's called A Harbour for Faithful and True Subjects. It's actually specifically a reply to Knox, and he goes through all of Knox's arguments. Aylmer argues that queenship is legitimate. First of all, because God can make exceptions, as in fact he does, according to Aylmer. Second, he disputed Knox's reading of the Bible. He argued that the Bible was a historical document. It did not provide the kind of universal rules that Knox said it did. He also pointed out that men could be just as bad governors as women could. There's one really crucial thing about Aylmer's argument, however. He argued that queenship could be kind of sort of mitigated by the way the country was governed. Specifically, that a queen would have male advisors who would not only advise her, but she should accept their advice. also she couldn't abuse the laws because they were enacted and sort of enforced by Parliament, which was full of men, and male judges. That idea about the sort of checks and balances, if you like, on the Queen was not actually a new idea. It'd actually been circulating since at least the 1530s and was a kind of growing and common way of thinking about how any monarchy should work, irrespective of the gender of the monarch. So those are the kind of general ideas about queenship at this time. There are also some, if you like, practical problems posed by queens. One of the main functions of a monarch is to produce an heir, so that the crown passes sort of peacefully to the next generation. And this is particularly the case if the monarch is a queen, because that's the purpose of queens, is to produce heirs. But when the queen is the regnant queen, the one actually governing, then this is very problematic. In a sense, the obvious thing would be to marry a foreign prince, because that a foreign prince would be of equal status. But that raises a whole set of problems. The Queen it's thought likely she would go and live abroad with her husband, and any child they produce might inherit all of their lands, the King's and the Queen's, and it's thought that England therefore would get sort of subsumed into another nation. The alternative, of course, would be to marry a sort of a homegrown English nobleman. But that's going to be problematic because it will kind of raise one of the nobles above not only all his peers, but potentially above the Queen herself, and that could cause a lot of friction and a lot of conflict. By the time we get to Elizabeth's reign in particular, there's a further complication of religious division. There simply aren't that many good Protestant foreign princes for her to marry. And so should she marry a Catholic instead? Well, that will be very difficult. He might convert her or he might encourage English Catholics to carry on worshipping Catholicism in what is supposed to be a Protestant England. So lots and lots of problems for queens in the 16th century. So that's the theory, those are the problems. We now need to think about what actual people thought, Mary, Elizabeth and their councillors. Now, unfortunately, we have very little evidence about what Mary thought of her authority and how that might be sort of changed because she was a woman. The best bit of evidence we have is the speech she gives in front of Wyatt's rebels. And here she does use a lot of kind of quite traditional sort of feminine images about her as a mother and her subjects as her kind of children. But she also really emphasises her lineage, that she is the daughter of Henry VIII, and that is what legitimises her rule as a queen. So it looks as if Mary is aware of the sort of problems her gender poses, but she doesn't think that they disable her completely from governing. Elizabeth, we have quite a lot of evidence, and my absolute favourite bit is a letter that she dictates to Sir Francis Walsingham to be sent to the Earl of Shrewsbury, who is guarding Mary Queen of Scots. Elizabeth is in quite a bad mood at this point, and she emphasises, it's actually a message to Mary Queen of Scots, but she emphasises in this letter that she has sort of absolute power, she is the same as her father. Yes, she has councillors, but it's up to her to appoint them, to use them when she likes. She's not bound by any of their advice. It's up to her to make a decision. And she really rejects that there are any kind of checks and balances on her, particularly regarding her male councillors. What about their councillors? The people that they're working with, the people who help them govern. Unfortunately, we know virtually nothing about Mary's councillors in terms of what they think about gender. With Elizabeth, we have some really nice letters, particularly when councillors get a bit cross with her. And there we see that, yes, they do get frustrated with her. They do criticise her because she's a woman, and they attribute some of her indecisiveness, her refusal to do things, to the fact that she's a woman. But the real problem they have with her is that she's not Protestant enough. The things that frustrate them are her refusal to help the Dutch rebels, or her refusal to deal with Mary, Queen of Scots. It's all about religion. That's what really kind of annoys them, if you like. Okay, so how does queenship actually work under Mary and Elizabeth? Now, for Mary, I'm really convinced by the arguments that John Guise has put forward in his book, The Tudors, A Very Short Introduction. And his ideas are kind of very different from the traditional ones put forward by someone like David Loades or Glyn Redworth. What Guy argues, and he has a lot of evidence to support this, is that Mary actually governs like Henry VIII did, and in fact how a lot of French kings do during the 16th century. What she does is she gathers around her a group of male advisors whom she particularly trusts, and she discusses things with them, and when she has come to a decision, it then, if you like, gets moved out to the Privy Council for them to sort of execute policy and actually sort of sort things out for her. This is precisely what Henry VIII did, particularly after the fall of Wolsey. It's what we see a whole succession of French kings doing in the 16th century. There's also a really super article written by Elizabeth Russell in the 1990s, which is published in the journal Historical Research. And she shows how Mary, in many ways like Elizabeth, was very good at exploiting her gender, that she was very good at pretending or telling people she was a weak and feeble woman as a way of getting what she wanted. And she used that very effectively in negotiating the reconciliation of England back to Rome with the papacy. So for Mary, I think I would say that she's aware of the problems posed by her gender, and she is certainly keen for her husband, Philip II, to take an important role in governance. But she doesn't think that her gender disables her from being the monarch, and she sometimes exploits her gender to get what she wants. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, there is a debate amongst historians about how queenship functions during Elizabeth's reign, whether or not it's her gender that's the problem or her religion that causes the conflict. My own view is actually she operates quite similarly to Mary. Again, we have a group of advisors around her whom she particularly trusts. She also takes advice from individuals who are not formally councillors or anything, and she makes her own decisions, or more usually doesn't make a decision, and that can be a deliberate strategy. Refusing to make a decision or failing to make a decision is a different way of saying no. All the issues that cause friction between her and her councillors all boil down to different opinions on religion. So that's the marriage and succession, and therefore whether there will be a Protestant heir, about Mary, Queen of Scots, who until Elizabeth has a child would be her heir, and Mary, Queen of Scots is a Catholic, so she might reconcile the realm back to Rome, and lots of issues about religious reform. These are all the things that create tension between Elizabeth and her councillors. And the way Elizabeth governs, like Mary, like Henry, is yes, to have male advisors. All monarchs are supposed to listen to advice, but she doesn't believe that she has to accept it, and that sometimes annoys her councillors. As for her councillors, they kind of accept this. They recognise that she is not only the daughter of Henry VIII, but she's a divinely appointed monarch. And ultimately, it's that deference to hierarchy and to her divine appointment that stops councillors, whatever their problems and conflicts with her, from imposing their will on her. They recognise that, in a sense, even though she is a woman, she is royal, she is a divinely appointed monarch, and there is a limit to how much pressure they can put on her. And I think probably the best example of this, or the best proof of this, is that if councillors had believed that they could boss Elizabeth around, that they as men were in charge, then I don't think Mary Queen of Scots' head would have stayed on her shoulders for quite so long as it did.